Okay, our next speaker, a few minutes early, so we're not going to run out of time, which is because I'm sure we're going to have many questions for her. Ramita Tandon is the newly appointed Chief Clinical Trials Officer at Walgreens, and Walgreens is doing very, very interesting work in making trials accessible and democratic. So thanks, Ramita.
Thank you, Lisa. Good morning, everybody. Happy Friday. When Lisa reached out to me and said, would you be interested to come talk at this morning's session, I thought, gosh, one, how do you correlate Walgreens to deep tech and neurotech? And this is our first time being here at the session, but I think it might be helpful for all of you guys to understand, the transformation that we're going through at Walgreens. Last year, we actually announced our move into healthcare. And, for those that are not familiar with Walgreens, we're a 120-year-old retail pharmacy brand that has over 9,000 stores and pharmacies across the U.S. We service about 160 million lives that come into our stores and pharmacies on a regular basis. And 78% of the U.S. population is within 5 miles of a Walgreens. So if you think about just where you live today, probably is a Walgreens not too far from where you live. And so for us, it was, how do we activate our locations and start to do more in this healthcare ecosystem? And during the COVID-19 pandemic, one of the most historic healthcare crises that we all confronted, the pharmacies, when everything else was shut down, were open. We had people coming into our pharmacies, anxious, asking a ton of questions, and really needed help on how to navigate the complex situation of COVID-19. We administered over 70 million vaccinations across the US. We were front and center when most were shut down. And folks, had always asked, is this a one size fits all? It wasn't. We had communities across the nation that simply were extremely resistant, that weren't aware of the potential health benefits of the vaccines, and simply just were, needing more information. So there was tremendous amount of grassroots efforts that had been taken across the nation. And so for us as a retailer, it is, how do we start to disrupt this healthcare ecosystem, the fragmentation that exists in this healthcare ecosystem, and start to deliver more what I call interoperable health in our local communities. So today we have over 200 plus locations across the US, and we'll have about 10 in Massachusetts that will serve as healthcare destinations where patients and consumers can come in and get screening, diagnostic, and phlebotomy services. We're continuing to expand the type of healthcare services that we want to provide in our local communities, but ultimately we want to be able to connect into our communities and making sure that we can close the care gaps that oftentimes we see, particularly with patients with chronic or complex conditions. So we are creating this clinical care models within our organization and starting to deploy a lot of that within our communities. And so what does that mean for the world of clinical trials? So I joined about 10 months ago myself, and the idea was, how do we take what we're doing within our organization, within healthcare, and start to apply that framework into clinical trials? We know that for those of you that are in understanding of the clinical research enterprise system, less than 5% of the US population participates in clinical research. And of that cohort, 75% are Caucasian male. So as a nation, we have tremendous work that needs to be done to move the needle around access, equity, and diversity. Therapies that are coming out today are not representative of the US population. In fact, we're lucky here being part of a state of Massachusetts because we're access to an ecosystem of sophisticated healthcare systems, a number of urgent care centers. But if you go down deep south or in the rural Midwest, as I call the medical deserts, they're not as lucky. They don't have access to the type of sophisticated medical healthcare systems. And more importantly, if you ask them about what a clinical trial is, you'll get two answers. Number one, they have no idea what you're talking about. Number two, there's significant resistance about clinical research and the enterprise, particularly around the mistrust with big pharma and the industry. And the Tuskegee syphilis study, for those that are familiar with it, obviously cast a fairly large shadow amongst communities of color, particularly African American communities that don't get access to this type of cutting edge research. So more needs to be done. And so some of the metrics that you're seeing here on the slide really addresses what's happening with the overall clinical research enterprise. And in general, when clinical trials are conducted, we know for a fact that 80% of trials fail to meet the enrollment goals. Not just even looking at the diversifying the patient populations, just general enrollment goals. It's hard to go find patients. We see that once a patient does get access to clinical trials and does participate, the dropout is significant. 20% of patients who enroll start to drop out. It's tough. And then finally, from a manufacturer's perspective, it has a huge impact on the cost, the daily cost for the loss of patients that are on trials or even patients that are not able to participate in trials. So at Walgreens, our goal is to leverage our physical footprint. Of the 9,000 stores that I mentioned earlier, nearly half of our locations are in socially vulnerable areas. What does that mean? It allows us, as researchers, as manufacturers, as an industry, is to start tapping into these communities and get them to understand, so educate and empower these communities on the value of clinical research in their health outcomes. We, as an organization, want for clinical trials to be viewed not just some research entity nuanced with a manufacturer industry, but rather as a care option. If standard of care of therapy is not applicable for patients, clinical trials ought to be an option for patients that cannot necessarily use standard of care of therapy. We know that when patients do have a chance to participate in clinical research, there's a tremendous amount of hurdles that patients have to face when they participate. Could be travel, could be cost, and the further south you go or in the Midwest, the hurdles become pretty significant. Our goal is to be able to activate our locations to serve as clinical trial sites, to make it convenient and make it more localized for patients who want to participate and have the ability to come into a Walgreens and to be able to get clinical trial visits conducted while they're at a Walgreens. And then finally, as I mentioned earlier, it's an updated statistic, but we've now administered 70 million COVID vaccines across the nation. So the learnings that we had during the COVID-19 pandemic were tremendous. We understood what was happening in these local communities, what these communities needed from us. It wasn't just simply, let's bring a vaccine, come into a Walgreens and get a shot in. They needed time. They needed more education and empowerment. And a lot of that can be applied to the world of clinical research. As we're all thinking about making the next drug, the mechanisms of actions, that's good. But we've got to spend time with these communities and get them to understand the value of research and what it means for their health outcomes. So we launched the clinical trials business segment in June of this year. And it's really phase one. And what this means is we have 160 million lives across the nation that we have access to. We know where they're located. We have a sense of their health outcomes, their patient journey. Not only do we have access to their pharmacy records, but we also have access to the EMR records. So we are putting together both the medical record of that patient as well as the pharmacy record together. And what that does is it enables us to understand holistically that patient journey at a deep level. So rather than tapping into thousands, hundreds of thousands of patients and seeing if they're interested in clinical trials, I call that passive recruitment, we are taking much more of a tech-enabled and a proactive approach to find patients. that are going to be suitable for a clinical trial. So if you have a diabetes product, you have an oncology product, our goal is to be able to reach out to patients proactively, give them the option. Now, they have the option to opt out. So if they're not interested, that's fine. We give them the option. But we're creating more of a precise way to find those patients across the nation and at least giving them the opportunity to participate. The second piece is trials to patients. Today, our clinical research enterprise forces patients to go to an investigational site, whether it's an academic setting, whether it's urgent care setting, or a setting that might be too far from a patient, particularly in some of the more communities of unsupported areas or communities of color. It's a challenge, and it's a barrier for access and participation. So we are activating our locations across the US. I mentioned we've got 200 healthcare destinations where we're providing these healthcare services. Of the 200, we've got about 15, and we're continuing to scale up, that are considered clinical trial sites. We just launched. We're starting to partner with manufacturers as they're bringing their trials to us and looking for support. And so more to come as we continue to publish on the NPS scores and just generally the qualitative and quantitative nature of the operating model. But our goal is to not displace the provider and the patient relationship that exist, but certainly be supplementary or complementary to the ecosystem. We want to make sure we're hyper-personalizing the patient journey as they participate in clinical trials with us. And finally, it's the real-world evidence and informatics engine that we have at Walgreens. I'm a firm believer we have so much information out there today in a real-world setting. We know how patients are handling themselves when they take a product. There's a lot of information out there. We're using that information to become more directional and support manufacturers as they're looking to develop their products from early stage and throughout the life cycle of the product. Take those real-world insights, help to start make decisions on who the patient population ought to be when they're participating in trials. Looking at the diverse nature of patient population and making sure those patients are also accounted for when we're starting to think about the demographics and the right patient population for a trial. There's a lot more we can do. Obviously, we're sitting on a mount of information across the nation, and we at Walgreens are working in a safe, compliant fashion to use that information and to be able to support the industry and move the needle in areas that I think we've been stuck for so long. Again, I can't emphasize enough around the real nature of real-world evidence. I think there's a lot of information both from a qualitative and quantitative perspective that can be leveraged. Certainly the FDA is becoming more involved in how we use real-world data. Certainly the 21 First Century Act that was put in place back in 2016 allowed for the industry and the ecosystem to start to use information, what's happening in the real world, and start to make some decisions. And so you'll start to hear more from Walgreens as we start to bring our patients and consumers into our locations. It's about what can we learn from them? How are they experiencing the clinical trial journey? Are there changes that we can make? The impact the product is having on that patient. We'll be collecting a lot of that information, and we'll be pushing it back into the ecosystems for others, manufacturers, research, and others to be able to leverage for themselves. This is just a quick depiction of the services that we are providing, at Walgreens. I talked through this a little bit earlier, but it's really around being more patient-centric. I think, those of you that are in the clinical research enterprise, the enterprise has been built to support the providers, manufacturers, and I think now with the guidance that's coming out from the FDA around diversification of patient populations, the use of real-world data, and looking at alternative design models for clinical trials, we're starting to see more of adoption and doing things differently than things have been done in the past 10 years. More importantly, at the congressional level, there's a number of bills that are being sponsored. For example, Representative Robin Kelly, who's pushing a bill, the NIH Diversity Act, and we're hoping that to get signed. That will push the industry to make trials more equitable, accessible, and making sure patient populations are representative of the US population. So we're activating our locations, we're bringing in technology to help digitize aspects of the clinical trial workflow. We want to make it more easier for patients to participate. We think about COVID-19, when things were shut down, telehealth became a way for providers and caregivers to interact with the patients. We're doing the same. We're also leveraging our pharmacists and our pharmacy care teams. When patients come in to pick up their scripts, the pharmacist, that's a trusted caregiver, provider, and a brand, has an opportunity to have a dialogue with the patient and at least, at minimum, educate and empower them on the benefits of a clinical trial, and if there's a clinical trial that's applicable for that patient, the pharmacist will have the ability to talk to that patient about a particular trial. This is just an example of the patient journey that we have put in place. When we announced last year our move into healthcare, we spent about $8 billion on investments. We made investments in one of the larger primary care consortiums in the US. We believe more work needs to be done in the area of primary care. We acquired a company called Patient-centric, which is a home healthcare delivery model. We also believe aspects of healthcare can be delivered at patients' homes. And then we also acquired Shields Health, which is very focused on the specialty chronic disease areas. They build out integrated delivery care models within 75 healthcare systems across the US. And so as you think about the journey here, as it's depicted on the slide, it's as soon as a patient walks into a Walgreens, how do we capture that patient, educate and empower that patient, get them grounded on the particular trial, walk them through the various steps so that they don't feel like they're lost in the shuffle. We have healthcare advisors, we have technology. Whatever it takes, we'll hyper-personalize that process so that we can retain that patient throughout the clinical trial journey. The most important piece here at Walgreens that's important to us is that typically when a clinical trial is completed and a patient completes its obligation, they get a letter thanking them for their time, and then it's done. Here at Walgreens, we plan to continue the care for that patient. So when a patient completes a clinical trial, they'll be rolled into a clinical care program. They'll be then, our healthcare advisors will work closely with their primary care physicians or specialists to make sure that patients and their care is continued and there's no care gaps. And that's important for us as part of the last mile enablement that we're going to support as part of the patient's journey. And I'm sure everybody's probably thinking, obviously we're sitting on data, records, how are we building out this clinical research infrastructure within, a large organization like Walgreens? We're 250,000 people deep worldwide. We have built a very rigorous compliant framework. We've worked closely with HHS, with the FDA, and a number of regulatory and legal bodies to make sure that as the patient is identified and we do the outreach as part of being a covered entity, we give the patient an opportunity to opt in and opt out. If they opt in, they run through the process, and our goal is to make sure that we collect the information from the patient as fast as we can, and to be able to support the manufacturers, particularly as they're looking to collect the information for publication purposes, for submission purposes, but our goal is to collect both quantitative and qualitative information in the most secure and compliant fashion. And finally, our goal, again, just from a Walgreens perspective, being new into the clinical research enterprise, is to be able to help this overall ecosystem to not only increase access, but also making sure that we provide retention of patients that participate. That metric that I shared, that less than 5% of the US population that participates in clinical research, Our goal is to go above that number and making sure that we can give all our communities across the U.S. access to cutting-edge therapies that many of you guys are working on today. We also want to make sure that we're championing the fact that clinical research is simply not nuanced in this research ecosystem, but it actually is a care offering. We are working very closely with the Biden administration and others in the government, as well as others across the nation from a provider's perspective, payer perspective, recognizing that clinical trials and the intersection into the overall healthcare ecosystem is critical. And if we can get providers to be able to offer clinical trials as an option when they start to see patients, for us, that's a huge win as we move towards this intersection of healthcare and research. We do believe that as we start to give trials, bring trials into our local communities, we're offering treatment options for diverse communities that have never been tapped into in the past, and to be able to participate. So our goal is to be able to, again, move that needle of 3/4 of this nation are Caucasian male that participate in clinical trials. We want to see more diverse representation. And so when products are coming out to the marketplace, it's representative of the U.S. population. And finally, our goal is to address a lot of the barriers that we see in trial participation, whether it's travel, compensation, what have you. We believe by activating our locations that are 5 miles within patient populations or within communities of people, we hope that that allows for patients to come in, at minimum, learn about the benefits of clinical research, and then decide to sign up. And so we hope that that ultimately enables better empowerment and helps the entire clinical research enterprise of bringing more people into the ecosystem. So with that being said, thank you and indulging me to talk about Walgreens as a retailer and moving into the clinical trial space. If there's time, happy to take questions. Yeah.
Is there a particular area of medicine that you're looking to prioritize in clinical trials, and at what stage are you looking at that interaction?
Yeah, for those that didn't hear the question is, are there specific therapeutic areas of focus for us, and what phase perhaps of clinical trials makes a sense? So there are 8 top diseases that have significant health equity issues. If you think about diabetes, CKD, cardiovascular outcomes, these are areas that impact the large swath of the U.S. nation. So for us, it makes sense for us to be able to support those therapeutic areas, because then we start to make a broader impact across the nation. But we've also been approached by a number of manufacturers that are looking at rare diseases because they're struggling to find the patients, or diseases that need better representation from a diversity perspective, like oncology and others. And so we're being very judicious on what we can and take, but for now, if we can tackle some of the big top 8 diseases, that's what we're doing right now. In terms of phases, it's really trials that are a bit more on the post-market side, or if it's an interventional trial that doesn't have a lot of interventional type of activities involved, because you can imagine coming into a Walgreens, we're not going to do an MRI of things of that nature that hospital care settings will take on. So we are partnering with a number of healthcare systems across the nation that want to be able to make sure that patients are retained. So for example, both Dana-Farber as well as Brigham Women are quite interested to see if they have the patients that participate within their ecosystems, they could use a Walgreens for follow-up on visits. So we don't lose those patients, and have the Walgreens do some of the simple things like a blood draw, screening, and diagnostic test. Yeah.
Hi, thank you. David McMullen from FDA. Very important topic. Thank you for speaking on it. I guess to build on that question, as you'll hear later, I represent the device side, and so do you envision right now the interventions that could be utilized are more drug-based, ones that could be delivered at the pharmacy? Do you envision a future maybe where, with those partnerships you mentioned, that could lead to devices or other types of interventions?
It's a great topic. As I said, we just launched phase 1, so certainly it's sort of a walk, run, for us to understand how the operating model is going to work, the effectiveness of the operating model, both from an operations perspective, but also from a patient's perspective. Yes, we are looking to mobilize efforts in the medical and device diagnostics area. We think that's a tremendous area of focus, but certainly that's going to require some additional, from a compliance perspective and a regulatory perspective, being a retailer, we'll have to outfit more of that. So I think the next calendar year, we're going to be looking at medical device and diagnostics too.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.